Hello and welcome to the EDHRECast. My name is Joey Schultz and I'm joined, as always, by my fantastic co-hosts. Up first, he asks the real hard-hitting questions, like, why is the new King Darien card not a creature type noble? It's Matt Morgan.
So I learned why the French and the German can't ever eat watermelon together. It's because they're always fighting over the rind.
Yeah,
we're back to the geography jokes, and I realize some people just get lost on those.
Yeah.
Can't tell up from down.
Thank you, Dana. I appreciate that. All right. Speaking of which, up next, he really likes the new card Urborg Lurgoyf because Goosebumps are his favorite books. It's Dana Roach.
Just the other day, my boss asked me if I did a good job performing under pressure, and I didn't really know how to answer that. I basically only know the guitar chords, so we will rock you.
I was just going to say, I was like, dum, 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 da, 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 da. Like, yeah, that was... I'm glad that we're...
I mean, once you start playing that opening lick, just tell them, well, don't stop me now.
That's so good. I love that. Anyway, this is the EDHRECast. EDHREC is the best deck building resource on the web for the Commander format, compiling data from deck lists all over the internet to provide helpful recommendations for new Commander decks. And here on the podcast, what we like to do is give all of that data just a little bit more context. Dana, do you mind telling us what it is that we're talking about in this week's episode?
Today we're talking about the brewing differences between when your commander is part of your deck's win condition or not part of your deck's win condition.
Yes, we are. And this is kind of I'm intrigued to see where this discussion goes. I'm not sure where this discussion is going to go, but it is an interesting facet of some decks when the commander is or is not the way the deck wins, and that does affect deck building. So it should be pretty interesting to get into. But real quick, before we get into that main topic, we've got a couple of quick shout outs to do.
First, we would like to thank Chase, also known as Mana Curves, for their work on editing the show. You can find them on Twitter at Mana Curves.
And you can support the show directly. You can like and subscribe on YouTube or any of your local podcasting applications that you have on your phones. Or you can go to patreon.com/EDHRECast, where we have patron tiers of all sorts of levels. Whether you want to join the Discord community that we have, you want to see all of our historic challenge stats picks. There's all that and more over at patreon.com/EDHRECast, including that patron tier where we give somebody a shout out just for supporting us, just for joining over at that website. And this week, we are giving a very special shout out to Sebastian Albrich. Thank you so much, Sebastian. I wanted to say Bastion because I watched The Neverending Story lately, but Sebastian, there you are. Thank you so much.
Oh, that's awesome and wonderful. Thank you so much, Sebastian. All of our patron support, it means the absolute world to us. And Matt, wow, The Neverending Story. That's a throwback that I did not expect today. I'm into that.
It's just a classic. Everybody should rewatch it every now and then.
Yeah. Interestingly, though, I have noticed it does end. Kind of a strange thing about that movie.
Twice, even.
There you go.
Joey, you were just telling us before the show that you don't like it when a TV show lies to you.
It's true. And I guess... But that movie gets a pass, okay? That movie is charming enough. It gets a pass.
Okay, all right, that's fair.
But before we get too sidetracked, let's get into our main topic. We are talking about brewing differences when your commander is or is not a part of your deck's win condition. I think that this is kind of like a subset, or it's like kind of related to a conversation that we've had a couple of times on this podcast where we're talking about commander-centric or commander-agnostic decks. Like, is the commander a main focus of your deck, or is it not a huge part of the way that the deck is going to function and stuff like that? And we've also talked about whether your commander is like the setup for the deck, or if it is the engine of the deck, or if it's the deck's payoff. So like there's a lot of different ways to interpret this. But Dana, how about I just go ahead and throw this topic to you when it comes to your commander is or is not a part of the way that your deck actually closes out the game. What is the thing that immediately comes to your mind when you are brewing that deck, and how does it make it feel different from other decks where that is not the case?
So the first thing that comes to my mind when your commander is part of the win condition is you just have to devote a lot more resources in that deck to ensuring you can actually utilize that win condition. Maybe it's more ramps so you can recast it multiple times. Maybe it's protection spells to keep it safe. Maybe it's things like Lightning Greaves or Swiftfoot Boots to protect it once it's on the field. But that, for me, is kind of that big difference. When I do that initial brew, if I know my commander is part of what it's going to take to win that game, I immediately start slotting in things to enable that, versus decks where my commander is not part of that win condition. That's not something I worry about nearly as much.
Okay.
Yeah, I would probably echo Dana's sentiments here. Whether or not your commander is important to your actual winning of any said game, you probably want to devote a certain amount of slots, more or less, depending on how involved the commander is, into protecting it. That's going to be the biggest factor, because if it's not around long enough to actually make an impact and do what you need it to do, whether it's my Kyler deck where I need it to be around for a few turns because I need to get plus one counters on it, which then makes all my other humans bigger so I can go to combat and attack. Or if it's something that I need around just for one turn for a quick burst of whatever value it is, it really depends. That's going to help influence how many utility slots you need to protect. That's kind of the very first question you should be asking when you're trying to evaluate, is my commander vital to how I win, or does it just supplement the strategy?
And I think also like how integral your commander is to that strategy makes a difference. There are some decks that the commander can be part of your win condition or is a part of your win condition. But you can maybe come up with a backup plan, like whether you have it in the deck or you have other things. Let's say you're playing some kind of an Enchantress deck. Maybe your commander is what you're planning on putting your enchantments on, but like in a pinch, you can put them on something else. On the other hand, let's say you're playing Kali of the Vast, always comes to mind. If you don't have Kali as your win condition in that she's the reason you're going to play 8 drops for free. And if you don't have access to Kalia and you're holding a fistful of 7 and 8 drop angels and demons and dragons, that radically changes what you're going to have to do. And probably nothing else in that deck is going to enable you to do what you planned on doing.
Yeah. Kali is a really tricky example, I'd say. Like in my mind, I think she kind of qualifies as like more of the engine of the deck that allows the deck to win, but she herself won't be like her on the field. She's not going to commander damage people too often, basically. It's more often going to be, you've got a bunch of 8/8 flying demons, angels, or dragons that are doing the rest of the work. And Kalia's importance might fall off later on in the game as you're able to just hardcast more and more of those or cheat them into play or something like that. I have a similar confliction with my Elegith deck, which is the Scry Sphinx. Anytime you would scry, instead you draw. That is such a powerful engine for that deck. And that is a very commander-centric deck for sure, because I need to have Elegith in play for my, my random Scry 3, Scry 6, Scry 5 spells to actually draw me as many cards as I want them to. And those cards don't do a whole lot unless I have my commander in play. But Elegith is not usually part of the deck's win condition. He's just the most powerful engine that facilitates that win condition. Usually the way that I'm winning with that deck is after I've actually drawn all of those cards and I'm using an Attempsis to punch someone with a brain, basically, and win with the Exodia finish instead. So it's a very powerful engine, but there's definitely a distinction there. Matt, I really like the point that you brought up about Kyler, because I had actually expected for you to bring up one of your Voltron decks, like your Valduk deck. But just because, commander damage seems like one of the most obvious ways in which your commander is the win condition of the deck. But that was not the first example that you brought up. You brought up Kyler, who pumps up all of your humans for each counter that is on Kyler. And yeah, that is a huge pump. It is not uncommon for you to get like +10/+10 from just your commander, which means you're putting a lot of eggs into one basket, even though you've got a lot of creatures in play, which I think is really interesting. It's a very different dynamic than I'd expected you'd bring up with.
Well, and two, yes, commander damage often is the quickest way to win with a Voltron deck, but eventually any creature that you have with 3 or 4 equipments and making it unblockable somehow, they're going to get through eventually. That's what I think a lot of shift has been, is you don't see maybe the Rafiq of the many, everything all in on one commander, because you have all these equipments. But Dana, even your equipment heavy decks, they're putting onto different creatures, and it's not always going to be the same specific commander that you're going all in on. So Voltron decks, to me, just have evolved to any creature will do, because a lot of times the equipment are just so powerful these days that you don't need it to be specifically your commander, because it's kind of the infect thing. Like 10 infect, like nobody's ever doing just 10 infect. It's a trying for the hordes and going for 30 on one person. It's kind of that way I feel with Voltron decks these days too, because there's so much access to double strike and ways to double up your damage or whatever it might happen to be. So the longer a commander needs to be on the battlefield, Voltron decks, oftentimes you need your commander maybe for one combat step to take somebody out. But with some commanders, like my Kyler deck, the commander needs to be out for several turns, which means I need more protection on there for a longer amount of time for the commander to be relevant.
Well, and there's even a lot of flex there. Rafiq's a great example of that, actually, because in a Rafiq deck, a lot of times you are counting on Rafiq having double strikes. So maybe you're not running other pieces of double strike equipment because you're like, well, it's redundant then. I have it on Rafiq. Maybe you are leaning heavily into Exalted as well. So like your other bodies might be much weaker in that deck because you're just assuming they will be granting Rafiq as Exalted since they're not going to be attacking as well. So like that's a commander where Voltron is very vulnerable to that. Rafik just that much more so, because the way the commander is built encourages you to rely on that commander even more than in a lot of different kind of Voltron decks.
Yeah, Matt, that's actually really interesting for me to hear you say that about the relationship to Voltron, about like basically having a backup Voltron in the deck to give a little bit of relief, or like kind of a pressure valve, maybe might be the way to say it, for how much importance there is on the commander. I don't know if that's my experience with the Voltron decks that I've got. I feel like most of the time when it comes to me, the commander being the source of commander damage and only having to deal 21 damage instead of whatever my opponent's life total happens to be, I feel like I haven't moved as much as maybe you have to like finding other backup things that will carry all of the enchantments or all of the equipment or getting all of the buffs for whatever it is that I'm doing. So I'm kind of curious. I kind of want to dig into that a little bit more. Like you brought up Dana's equipment deck, for example, and we have certainly seen that Dana will like animate one of his lands. Like I think he's got like Inkmoth Nexus in that deck, and then Arden can just suit it up out of nowhere. And that's a really great target, instead of having to always make it your Voltron stuff. And that is a really good example, but I personally struggle to come up with other examples, at least in my own decks, where that is the case. So I don't know. I'm curious to hear more about your backup Voltrons a little bit.
That was definitely a plan when I built that deck. I number one, wanted to build it in not Boros colors. So when I was looking at options in one of going with Azorius and building with Arden and Essior, that was one of the things that I found attractive about those two particular commanders. Obviously, Arden is really useful for equipping equipment for free, but Essior coming down on turn 2 and immediately protecting itself, for one, with the semi-ward ability, and then it's going to protect Arden on turn 3 with that same ability. And then it has evasion to start putting things on, so that's going to help me get through. But after several turns, particularly because the deck is a sword deck, there's a pretty good chance I'm just going to have protection from whatever spells you're going to be trying to cast to stop whatever creature is suited up. So that's a perfect example, like you said, of one where the first 5 turns of the game, SCR is important. After that, I can suit up any of those lands I have. I can suit up Arden himself if I need to. So very much so the importance of that particular Voltron commander completely falls off the table after like turn 6 or 7.
Interesting.
But I do think that's a little bit true in a lot of decks. For example, at some point the damage has been done. Like, you know, my Talrand deck is built around making Drakes with Talrand. It's not that different from Matt's Valduk deck. But at some point in that Talrand deck, when I have 6 or 7 Drakes out, do you really care about removing Talrand? You have bigger problems. I have a handful of creatures out and like a gravitational shift in play and something else out, and you have a bunch of Drakes swinging at you, each hitting for 5 or 6 damage or something. Removing Talrand at that point becomes pointless. So I think sometimes, even if your commander is a really important part of the deck winning the game, or at least enabling your win condition, you can get to the point in the deck where the commander's already put those pieces in place and just removing it doesn't solve anything. And that's, I think, another example of, it's a different version of that, but where the commander's importance falls off as the game progresses.
Well, and Dana, I think there's a really good kind of differentiation that needs to be made, because your Voltron deck can go all in very easily because of how Arden is worded, where you get to move all your equipments on. So it doesn't really matter what the creature is, you just need a creature. Whereas my Valduk deck that Joey was talking about, it very much is all in on one specific creature, and thankfully it's in the command zone, but the backup plans are a little few and far between when it comes to, okay, if the Valduk plan doesn't work, if he gets killed 2 or 3 times, how am I going to win the games? And
sure.
So my Valduk deck, it requires a little bit more protection than your Arden and Essior deck, because you just need a creature, but I need the specific one. So my commander deck, or my Valduk deck, probably puts a little more premium on protecting that one that I need. Yes, there are backups, but those are also, I only have 5 other creatures in the deck, and I may not always see one. So I want to make sure that the ones that I do get down, they're either easily protected, or they're recursive, or some way to make sure that even though Valduk Plan A did not work out, Plan B is still viable through regular combat damage, because the creature is sustainable in some other way. So the creatures that I'm picking, whereas like we said, Dana needs a creature, just a single body. It can be a 1/1 token that he's able to make very scary very quickly. A, because I'm not skipping mana costs the way Dana's deck is, but also B, the creatures are a little less durable sometimes. So I need to be a little pickier with those backup creatures that I'm putting in the deck.
That is an interesting point, though, Dana, about like the ways that a commander's importance will shift over game. I think that can be true of just about any strategy, really. When I think of, for example, zombie tribal, like there are going to be the Scarab God is a great zombie tribal example of like that is usually the win condition of the deck because the Scarab God will make your opponents lose so much life as your zombie army grows and grows and grows. Meanwhile, I have a Wilhelt zombie tribal deck instead, and Wilhelt is a lot more important at the beginning of the game where I'm like a little bit more flexible with being able to draw cards, and it's really helping me set up my engine, and it can also create additional tokens for me. But as the game goes on, Wilhelt is not a part of that deck's win condition at all. And having Wilhelt in play on turn 10 is not nearly as important as having him in play on turn 4. And that is the kind of thing where, yeah, this commander actually, I care about it a lot at one stage of the game and not as much later. Mimeoplasm would be another very different example. Mimeoplasm I cannot usually play early, but dang, that is a deck that really cares a lot about having really good and lethal combinations for Mimeoplasm. So I have to set that up, and the importance of Mimeoplasm is paramount by the time that we get around to turn 7 or 8. So that is an interesting thing to ask yourself, not just like, is the commander part of the win condition, but also when is that thing's timing the most important for the win condition to be able to land?
One important difference too, I think or thing that makes a difference, I think too, is when I tend to build a deck, I tend to have an idea about what I want to do, and then I tend to look for a commander that will facilitate that in some way. I don't know if most people brew that way. I think a lot of people look and see a commander and like, oh, I want to build that. And I think when you come at it from that angle, it just by default makes your deck much more reliant on the commander. Like when someone sees Muldrotha, they tend to be like, oh, I want to build a Muldrotha deck. And therefore, everything in that deck kind of hinges on that pin that is Muldrotha, versus the way I tended to do it, where I think I want what concept has caught my interest. Okay, how can I make that happen? I said I want to build an equipment deck, so I figured out 2 pieces that will enable me to do that. And I think that way of looking at brewing just by default makes my decks tend to not rely on the commander as much as someone who's coming at it from the point of view of, I see this thing and I like it, and now I'm going to build the deck based on what it's suggesting I do.
I mean, Dana literally just summed up the exact difference between our deck building strategies.
Yeah.
Dana finds, okay, this is the thing I want to do. Let me find the commander to accommodate that. I find the commander and I build the deck to accommodate that.
Same.
Sure. But for me, it's also, I want to build something like, I don't get to do this in other formats. I want to build around this commander, and neither of us is wrong necessarily either.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, I don't want it to come across to the viewers as I'm dissing on Dana. We'll diss on each other for other reasons, but our motivations is definitely not one of those reasons. Like it's just always fun for me to see this commander and, oh my gosh, what can I do with this? Whereas Dana, what can I do with this? And now I got to find a commander to fit this into. So it's funny how you word.
Right.
We're doing the exact same, just we're starting at different ends of the spectrum.
Right.
Yeah. It is of big importance here, I think, though, like to notice that like basically any strategy can be built with the commander as a very central part of the win condition or not. There are certain strategies, I would say, that do lend themselves more to one or the other. Like a Voltron deck, for example, with commander damage is going to be pretty commander-centric. That is kind of a given. And I would probably even say that like usually a wheel deck, often like a Locust God or a Nekosar. I'm trying to say it Nekosar instead of Nikosar because I know that you guys give me a hard time about my pronunciations on that one. Like that tends to be a lot of the main way that the game is going to be won is because of the payoff that the commander gives you from all of the wheels that you cast. And so the rest of the deck can just be about all those wheels. And then by contrast, like a tribal deck, for example, like I mentioned my Wilhelt earlier, the commander isn't often always a part of the win condition because a tribal deck is so synergistic that no one elf or zombie is necessarily more important than another elf or zombie. Or maybe Punisher decks would be another example of this. Like there are certain strategies that I think lend themselves to one or the other, but it really is just down to how you built it. I mentioned the Scarab God example earlier as that's a tribal deck that is different from the energy of a Wilhelt deck. Or if you went aristocrats, like Teysa Karlov is not necessarily commander-centric, I don't think. She amplifies what the deck is doing, but the deck can probably do it even if she's not there, versus like my Conrad deck is very aristocracy, and it's pretty all in on the commander as being the primary source of damage in that deck. So yeah, there's a lot of flexibility here, even within these big umbrellas, is basically what the energy that I want to kind of put out there right now. I think that is an important thing for us all to note, is the flexibility there. So if you do want to have a concept, if Dana wants to build an equipment deck, there's still a lot of flexibility in how commander-centric he wants that win condition to be.
So how much redundancy do you then bake in if your deck is more commander-centric in terms of win condition? There are some commanders you can't necessarily bake in redundancy, I guess, but like, is there a point where it's too much? Is there a point where you put in too much protection? How do you figure out what those boundaries are?
Well, and two, a good question to ask yourself is how easily is this effect replicated? If it's a Solvala Heart of the Wilds and you're just making a lot of mana with your commander, how easily can I make a lot of mana? Or if it's a Voltron, how easily can I find a powerful creature to turn sideways? And sometimes those effects are very easily replicated, so you don't need to worry too much about protection. Yes, obviously the commander's the best version. But if you're playing a Teysa Karlov deck, like Joey mentioned, you're still doing those aristocrat things. Teysa Karlov is just making it a little more effective. Mm-hmm. And you can find other ways to make those things more effective, whether it's more copies of your Zulaport Cutthroat effects, or you're doing whatever else you might be doing. So that's a really big question, is how easily can I find this same effect and put it in the 99 versus how desperate do I have to protect this one source of that effect that I need?
Yeah, I think we've done a whole episode about like having backup plans and plan Bs and plan C and how to navigate around those. And I think one of the main examples that we used in that episode was, it might have been your Omnath deck actually, Matt, because Landfall has so many different famous examples of like Avenger of Zendikars and Rampaging Baloths and Ulvenwald Hydra even, and New Multanis. And there are a lot of different ways that you can go. Kazakh Wolf Runs even. Like there are a lot of different cards that you can use in a Landfall deck to accumulate a lethal board state in one way or another. And that makes me unsure about whether, like, because I look at Omnath and I say, that seems like that's going to be a really big part of the win condition. And in fact, I would wager that like there are a lot of people out there who could build Omnath as like probably the only landfall payoff in the entire deck if they wanted to really try and streamline it and go eggs all in one basket. But that is not the way that you went with it. You like having the other things like the Rampaging Baloths that will also help out in the event that Omnath gets to be 15 mana and you're just not in the mood to cast it anymore, but you still want to make a whole bunch of tokens whenever you play lands.
Which has happened, yes.
Yes, yeah. And so that is a line that you have drawn. And is it like, was that an intentional thing, or did you just see cool card says landfall, let's put it in? Was it a thing based on feeling, or was there a definite intentionality there? Is a thing that I'm curious about.
Well, that deck specifically has gone through so many waves of dependency on Omnath. And then swung back the other way to, it's just a good creature in the command zone, and then back to, okay, I'm going all in on Omnath. So it depends really on what kind of support cards you want to play. Landfall decks have such a depth of options these days that you can play it however way you want. Whether you want to, I mean, you could probably build 3 different Omnath Locus of Rage decks, honestly, and have them all be very, very different, whether you're trying to go deep on the token route and making all these tokens from your landfall triggers, or you want to make one thing hit really, really hard. You can do a lot of different things. And so it was kind of, I settled on this current iteration just because that ebb and flow back and forth. I want Warstorm Surges. I want those types of Where Ancient Treads types of cards in the deck. And I want those to do a lot of the heavy lifting for me. So I've kind of settled in there, but you very easily could swing one way or the other. So it just really depends on what kind of style you want within that strategy. And I think that's one reason that Landfall is so popular, because you can do so many different things within that one strategy, or even with that one commander with that one strategy.
Well, and I feel like the last times that I've played against your Omnath deck, the way that you like demolished the table was with Escape Shift into Valakut with an Ancient Green Warden in play and a Dryad of the Elysian Grove to make sure everything is a mountain.
Yeah.
And all of your Valakut triggers happen twice, and you play a single Escape Shift, and then boom, everyone takes like 30 damage each. And it had nothing to do with the commander at all, but it was glorious.
Yeah.
Well, that's a great point of comparison to the example I used with Rafiq earlier. When we're talking about redundancy, there's two different kinds of redundancy. There's redundancy that doesn't stack or overlap, and there's redundancy that does. In the Rafik case, you probably don't want to run a backup Fire Shrieker or a backup Duelist Heritage or something.
Right.
As good as those cards are, they're dead in hand if Rafik is out, which is your entire plan. If your deck is working as intended, those cards don't do you any good. Duelist Heritage obviously is maybe a little bit better because you can use it on someone else's creatures, but like for the most part, you don't want redundant double strike effects in that deck. Versus Matt's deck, where it doesn't matter what he's doing, a landfall can trigger as many things as can be triggered by landfall as he has in play. That Woodfall Crashing Primus or Woodfall Baleth of Zendikar, whatever that particular landfall monstrosity he happens to have out is, that's going to trigger at the same time that Valakut the Molten Pinnacle is going to trigger, at the same time that Omnath is going to trigger. As many effects as you want to put in that deck and stack up are all going to work simultaneously. And I think that is the real difference. You have to make that determination about whether or not your backup plans will actually continue to work and make your deck improve as you play them, or whether or not they're going to clog up your deck if things are going well.
Yeah, the commander doesn't invalidate any cards that I could put in the deck, whereas there are some decks, like you said, Rafik of the Many, can invalidate certain amounts of cards that you would otherwise put into a Voltron-style deck. That's a really good thing that I see a lot of folks kind of glom over sometimes, it feels, where they're putting cards in, well, it's good in this strategy, but is it good in this commander in that strategy? And that's something that we've hinted at a few times on episodes before, but making sure that it's not working directly against or just directly overdone by your commander. Now, yes, Duelist Heritage probably, I would maybe consider it in a Rafik deck, not always, but man, I like giving other people's creatures double strike as a political tool. Yeah. But you are correct, Dana, that's probably not the first card you're going to reach for in that deck because yes, it's handy in a Voltron deck, but your commander specifically doesn't need it. And so finding those redundant effects, yes, you make sure that you have that effect at all times, but also is this an effect that you only want once and only once?
Yeah, no, there's a bunch of examples of that too. And I love the way that you said within, like, this is a thing I think we've mentioned before a couple of times on the show where like we as players will be like, oh, this card is good and might assume that means it's good everywhere. But no, context is absolutely required. There's a reason that Tatyova decks don't play Harmonize. They don't need them. There's a reason that, Dana, I don't think your Arden deck is playing Sigarda's Favor right now, is it?
It is not.
Which would allow you to free attach equipment. Your commander's already doing that so well that is a redundancy that is not effective. You have eliminated the need for those things. So that is a great distinction, Matt. I really love that. That is a huge point to bring in, that context is what makes cards good, not just cards being good in and of themselves in a vacuum.
Yeah, to talk about that Arden and SCR deck just for a moment, as effective as SCR is in that deck, if there were like 3 different variants on SCR, I wouldn't be running them because they wouldn't do my deck any good as a backup plan if I already had an SCR out, versus the creature lands I have in the deck, the Blink Moth Nexus, the Ink Moth Nexus, the Fairy Conclave, if I do have my commander out and suited up, they're still lands. They still do something in addition to what they are as my backup plan. Versus like you talked about how I'm not running Sigarda's Aid as a backup to Arden in that deck because it doesn't do me any good for the most part if I have Arden out, who's relatively effectively costed, so it's pretty easy to recast him multiple times. So I don't have backup plans there, or at least nearly as many as I do backup plans for SCR in the form of lands.
This is complicated stuff. Like I think that each individual brewer will draw a line in a different place for each of their decks. Even if they were to build, like Matt, as you mentioned, you could easily build 3 different types of Omnath decks. I think each one of us has a different landfall take, and we've all had different takes on that. And our relationship to the win conditions there does affect a lot of the stuff there. And the relationship to a backup plan is huge, because there are some backup plans that you're like, I might need it. And then there are some backup plans where you're just like, I just do not need this at all, because the commander's already giving me enough of that reliably and stuff like that. There are a few other questions on this topic that I do want us to get to. But before we get to those, I'm stealing back my right for the segue and to challenge the stats. And I think that we should do that right now. And I don't want you guys to steal the segue from me. So I'm going to do it. We're going to take a break and go to challenge the stats, and we're going to be happy about it. Is that all right?
Oh, if we have to be happy about it, then I guess we can.
You can put your sadness on the stack, but I have counterspell backup.
Fair.
Hello, Internet! We wanted to pause real quick to let you know that this week's Challenge the Stats is sponsored by Raycon Wireless Earbuds. Raycon's everyday earbuds look, feel, and sound fantastic. They have optimized gel tips for the perfect in-ear fit, and you know what? They're really dang comfortable. Raycons give you 8 hours of playtime and a 32-hour battery life, and they're half the price of other premium audio brands, so they'll totally help you out when you go and binge listen to the whole back catalog of all the past EDHRECast episodes. I love the everyday earbuds. They work great. They just don't budge. And I'm especially a fan of their noise isolation so that I can listen to podcasts without outside interruptions. And, I also really appreciate that they have earbud tap functions too. That's right. Just like Dominaria stun counters, these earbuds also have tap functions. Go to buyraycon.com/EDH today to get 15% off your Raycon order. That's buyraycon.com/EDH to score 15% off. buyraycon.com/EDH. And now, back to the show. All right, yeah, let's do it. There's so much data on EDHREC, but we don't always agree with that. Sometimes I think that cards see too much or too little play. So let's challenge those stats. And Matt, how about you start us off this week?
So my challenge this week, actually, I dropped the name of the commander a little bit earlier. It's for Selvala, Heart of the Stampede decks. And one of my favorite new cards from this Dominaria United set that Dana actually beat me to the punch and talking about on social media is Relic of Legends. So this card actually, I think, is going to be overplayed with where it's trending. So I hate challenging a card as it's becoming opened in packs, but I want to make sure we're catching these trends at an appropriate time. So Selvala, Heart of the Wilds is 1 green for a 2/3 elf scout that says whenever another creature enters the battlefield, its controller may draw a card if its power is greater than each other creature's power. And then the important ability here is pay a green and tap it to add X mana of any combination of colors where X is the greatest power among creatures you control. So Relic of Legends is an amazing, amazing new card from Dominaria United. It's 3 mana for an artifact that taps for 1 mana of any color. But also you can tap an untapped legendary creature you control to add 1 mana of any color. Now that ability is fantastic, and oftentimes people have legendary creatures just kind of hanging out in their decks or on the battlefield ready to be tapped for mana with this card. But Selvala, Heart of the Wilds is actually a deck that I do not believe needs it. They're currently in the 536 decks that have been updated since Dominaria United went up on EDHREC. People have already been putting Relic of Legends in Selvala decks. Now, Selvala itself taps for mana. You don't need to tap Selvala to Relic of Legends for mana. But if you look at the typical deck, all the creatures either already are not legendary or they have tap abilities that you want to be activating already. So it's something that just you're not going to have an excess of legendary specific creatures laying around in your Selvala deck. You're either going to be attacking with them because they're massive creatures like Grothama the All-Devouring, or they're mana dorks. You want to make sure when you're looking at all of these creatures and all these decks that you're putting Relic of Legends in, how many legends do you have laying around that don't need to be attacked? They don't already are doing anything. And that's something very important you need to be answering for yourself. I personally am going to put Relic of Legends in a ton of my own decks, but if you have a Selvala, Heart of the Wilds deck, you probably do not want to be putting it in there. There's just other better things you can be doing with that slot.
Yeah, Matt, I love Relic of Legends. It's a fantastic card. I do think I tend to agree in a deck that's already making a massive amount of mana. It's probably relatively redundant, particularly when you're also in a deck that has access to land ramp that's much more difficult to interact with. So while I tend to run it in a whole bunch of decks, I don't think I want to run it in Selvala either.
That's just a really good card in general, too. Like
it's fantastic.
Like I feel like most people will see like, oh, this should go into Legends decks, like with a lot of legendary creatures. But it's just a good tap outlet for like a whole bunch of different things. Like I really like this card a whole lot. But if your committer's already making mana, already doing the tapping, I feel like this is, in my brain, this is more of a tap outlet kind of card than it is like necessarily a Legend specific or a mana producing card. But I don't know. Maybe that's just me. Mm-hmm. Also, Matt, real quick, actually, I'm going to have to address both you and Dana about this, because Dana had his very fun wild crusher of Avenger of the Wild Primus of Zendikar moment, and then you also accidentally pronounce it Selvala, Heart of the Stampedes. So you know what? Y'all have given me some grief about my pronunciation.
Selvala has her Stampedes, though. It's an actual card. I wasn't making up cards. I was referring to other cards.
He was talking about what is in her heart.
He was portmanteauing on accident.
Who are we to question?
I'm just saying, I get some grief about my pronunciations on this podcast sometimes, but I'm hold up a mirror to you guys every so often. Anyway.
All right, Kusar, why don't you move on?
All right. You know what? I better just take this moment to move to my own challenge now. And I'm going to be challenging a card for Tasha the Witch Queen decks, specifically a card that I also think is getting a little overplayed here. So Tasha the Witch Queen is a really fun Dimir planeswalker from Baldur's Gate who makes you demons every time you cast a spell that doesn't belong to you. And her abilities will help you gather more and more of those spells as well. And especially you like to fill up the graveyard and cast a lot of your opponent's stuff from the graveyard. There are cards like Memory Plunder, for example, that help out with this. But there are also some cards that are very deceptive in the ways that they don't actually help out with this. Specifically, I'm looking at the card Flawless Forgery, which so far appears in about 16-17% of Tasha decks. This is a little bit distinct from Memory Plunder type of cards. Memory Plunder will actually cast an instant or sorcery directly from your opponent's graveyard. So that will trigger Tasha's ability to give you those 3/3 demons. Flawless Forgery, however, has a slightly different wording, and there are a couple of cards like this, like Spell Twine as well. They exile the instant or sorcery card from the opponent's graveyard, and then you copy that spell and you can cast the copy. But you're casting a copy there. You're not casting your opponent's spell. You're not casting a spell that doesn't belong to you. You're just casting a copy. So you will not get any demons when you're casting a spell like Flawless Forgery or Spell Twine. So be very, very attentive about the wording on those spells. It's pretty important for a commander like Tasha. So 16% of the 2,000 Tasha decks playing Flawless Forgery, move on to a different spell instead, fill up those graveyards, find other stuff to steal instead of this one, and you'll get a lot more demons, a lot more bang for your buck. Okay, Dana, all you.
I want to talk about a card that I think should see more play for sure, Echoing Truth.
Oh my God. Dana!
I'm kidding.
Oh my goodness.
I have a challenge this week.
For reference, listeners, Dana has challenged that card 3 times, repeating himself multiple times, in addition to a listener-submitted challenge the stats, which that listener went to patreon.com/EDHRECast to submit a challenge stats.
And that right there is the truth, the echoing truth.
The echoing truth. Yes. So our suggestion this week does come from a Patreon supporter, Cold Side in our Discord. His challenge stats pick this week is for Terrain Generator. It's a colorless land that can go into any deck, and it's currently showing up in 15,000 decks, which is just 1% of the possible decks on EDHREC. Decks that can draw lots of cards and tend to have mana to spare, like control decks, would benefit greatly from it because it has the ability to pay 2 and tap it. So basically 3 mana to put a basic land from your hand onto the battlefield tapped. He runs it in Kawain, and it lets him play 2 lands a turn after he gets it down very frequently. I have some experience with this card. I run it in my Talrand Sky Summoner deck. There's, I think, almost 30 instant spells in that deck. I oftentimes try to spread them around, and there's also a handful of, counter spells in there as well. And there are enough times with that card where I just don't have I keep counter magic up in case I need to protect my commander. That's an important part of that deck's win condition. And nobody tries to remove it. So at the end of the turn, I will play a land with that Terrain Generator and untap everything and be good to go again. I don't run it everywhere. I only have it, I think, 2 of my 14 decks. But in the decks where you are playing that particular play style, particularly if you can afford to have utility lands because you're, playing in a 1 or 2 color deck, it is a very, very good card, and I do agree it should see more play.
I am all on board with that. That is really cool. Dana, there's something that you just mentioned there that I think might segue us back into our topic here, where you mentioned that one of your commanders there is an important part of your deck's win condition. And I think that actually is one of the distinctions that maybe we need to fully hone in on about this episode, about and again, I think this is tough to recognize, but is the commander a part of the win condition, or is your commander the win condition? I mentioned Elegith earlier as an example of that's the engine of the deck that's drawing me so many tons of cards. But I wouldn't in my head normally associate that is the win condition of the deck, but at the same time, it can be if I want it to be. Once I've drawn all of those cards, I can attach an Imperial Plate to it, I get a huge buff for it, and then that can commander damage for a win. Or if I have a Psychosis Crawler in play, the fact that I have Elegith in play turning all my scries into draws means that Psychosis Crawler is now actually lethal. And without Elegith in play, that would not work as well. But I still would be very hesitant to call Elegith the payoff or the win condition, I guess. It can be a strong part of that, but it is a distinct form there. And I guess that's just an important distinction for us to finally hone in on as we move into the second half of this episode. I feel like there are plenty of examples of this where the commander is deceptive. It's difficult to find out, wait, is this actually the thing that's winning me the game? Or is this just a very commander-centric part that isn't actually the way that the game will end?
Sure. So, well, and here's a good example of that. So I have a Jury Master of the Review deck that's built around sacrificing treasures to make Jury ginormous and then having Jury die and deal damage to a person, hopefully lethal damage. And then I can recast Jury and hopefully do that all again. But Jury's a win condition of that deck. And that's not something that really is replicatable. There's not other things I can run as a backup plan that I can put counters on in those colors necessarily by sacrificing treasures that then deal damage when they just die. I could run a bunch of fling effects or something, but like that's a whole different deal than just having it all baked into that one creature. Jury is the win condition versus, say, Talran that I just mentioned, where Talran being out while I cast instant and sorcery spells makes Drakes that are the win condition, I guess, and it's important to have Talran in play to get to that point. But like I mentioned earlier, if Talran goes away at a certain point in the game, that becomes kind of irrelevant. Additionally, there's things in the deck, cards like Docent of Perfection or Murmuring Mystic or Whispering Wizard, all creatures that do a very similar thing. When I cast a instant or sorcery or a non-creature spell in the case of Whispering Wizard, that then will also make me some kind of a small evasive flying token creature. So while they're not necessarily backup plans and that they stack with Talran, there are situations where like I've had Talran killed 4 or 5 times in a game because I just didn't draw counter magic or didn't draw protection. And I was able to land that Docent and still do the same exact thing for the most part because they're just enabling the win condition. I think it's much easier to find a backup plan for something that's in your command zone that's an engine to enable the win condition than it is to find a backup for the actual card being the win condition, like in the case of your Corvold deck, Joey, or in my Jury deck.
Corvold? I don't have a Corvold deck.
Sorry, Sir Conrad.
Conrad deck. There we go. Also a very, very mean one, though. Yeah.
And then there's always some fun middle ground, too. I know I immediately think of my Ukima and Khazar deck when we're talking about, is this the way that it wins, or is it part of how it wins, or is it just a vessel? +1/+1 counters, especially with how many ways there are to recycle those counters these days, is really easy to make any given creature lethal. Now, in my Ukima and Khazar deck, the Ukima being unblockable, having that leaves the battlefield ability, it makes it a very, very juicy target, but I don't have to specifically win with Ukima in order for that deck to win. And so, yes, in early stages, it's a very easy target, but as the game progresses, it turns into one of those types of things that Dana's decks often do, where the commander's there as an option, but it doesn't have to be the option. A big master biomancer is going to make a whole army very, very powerful. So it doesn't need to be specifically the cards that are in my command zone, but it does make it easier just because I have that ready access to that in my specific deck.
Honestly, Matt, this is actually an experience that resonates really hard with me too, because you've got your +1 counter deck in similar colors to my Rayhan and Ishai deck, which collects a bunch of counters, and then I love to move those counters around. And honestly, like that is a deck where I really struggle with how commander-centric do I make this deck? Is this deck more commander-centric than I thought? And I feel like this is actually a great example of how difficult it can be to notice when you've accidentally overcompensated. Like if you are putting a bunch of like extra protection, extra counter spells, more of the Swiftfoot-Bootsy types of cards into your deck to protect your commanders existing when they're not actually as integral to the end of the game to your deck's win condition, I think that can actually like be hard to spot because those are good cards. Heroic Interventions, Teferi's Protections, counter spells, those are good cards to protect what's yours. They're never going to be bad necessarily. But I did notice, and it took me, I think, years to notice this, but over time in my +1 counter deck, I had put a lot more focus on Ishai, for instance, which was gaining so many +1 counters at a good rate and could commander damage my opponents out. But the point of that deck was actually to be full of a bunch of pinatas. I would move those counters onto an Elenda in response to like a Wrath effect or a Destroy effect, so that then I would be left over with a bunch of tokens if my +1 counters were ever compromised in some way. And yeah, I don't know, it took forever for me to realize, oh, I actually don't need as many of the counterspell type of things to protect the commander, because Rayhan's already doing the work of a plan B. So I don't need all of these other plan plan B and plan C type of cards in my deck. A single Mana Gorger Hydra can actually all on its own take over a game, or a single Colonian Hydra, doubling counters, even just its own counters every turn, that can all on its own win a game. Why am I building this deck to be so commander focused? And I think maybe it has to do with the fact that I always will view those cards like the heroic interventions and the counterspells and protecting the commander as being super important to a deck, but maybe they're not always. It's just really hard to recognize when you've overcompensated on a protection package, for example. I think that's a very difficult thing to discover.
And that's just something that I think folks often have, and we've talked about it several times. Joey, you specifically about how other people view your decks. How integral do you think your commander is versus how scary do other people think the commander is for that deck?
Yeah.
Because Joey, you've talked about how, oh, well, Conrad's not my most powerful deck. Oh, no, it is. Don't you worry. It is. But also for your Rayon and Ishai deck, Ishai, yes, gets a ton of counters, but also Forgotten Ancient does a very good impression of that. So it's funny that just when the more that we play decks, the more we're able to kind of realize, and sometimes playing around with how important is this commander to my deck. Let me try to play a whole game and win without casting my commander. That's something sometimes a challenge to kind of gauge how important that commander is for your deck and just where it is in its current setup.
I like that. I like that. To stand up in defense of my Conrad thing, I know that that card is ridiculous, but I just want to say that is definitely not my most consistent deck with the power output. I have other decks that I feel like are more reliably going to create a position against all odds, whereas Conrad, he does have some foibles. That boy can absolutely be tripped up, and it can be easy to stop him. If he gets stopped completely. That was the distinction in my head. But yes, other people's viewpoints is a much more informative thing than just me gauging my own stuff. It is a very good bridge to cross to see where you feel with your commanders versus where other people feel with the commander. So don't throw me completely under the bus, Mr. Morgan.
Well, I do think it's important thing to note too that just because a commander is your win condition doesn't mean it's a win condition immediately. Like Joey, you can play Sir Conrad, and I can look at the table and be like, I know Sir Conrad is required for this deck to win, and I know it's going to deal a significant amount of damage over the course of 5 turns, but that other thing right there that person played is going to kill me next turn. And just because that is a problem and is an important part of your deck doesn't mean it's necessarily the primary win condition. And again, let's go back to Rafiq. That's the problem with Rafiq. Rafiq doesn't give you the opportunity to point at something else and go, okay, I will deal with Sir Conrad in 3 turns because I have to solve this other problem. Now, Rafiq is the problem you have to solve now because you don't know if next turn when it swings out, are you just going to blow up and die? So that's also kind of one of those things where I would bet something like Sir Conrad, and this is something I found with Jury as well, they can, despite being the focal point of the deck, they can afford to sit there unprotected sometimes because people only have access to so many answers and so much removal, and plenty often there's going to be a problem that has to be addressed right now, and those are not oftentimes what that today problem is. That's a problem for next turn Dana to deal with.
And that's absolutely a situation I've come across with and against several decks that we've all talked about here. My Kyler Sigardian Emissary deck, yes, Kyler gets big enough to eventually kill you, but it needs to sit around for a few turns, whereas Champion of Lamholt is already making things very hard for people to block, so that's taking the attention off the commander, at least immediately. That has happened all the time. We'll see these things that Joey's doing, and okay, he's getting ready to do something scary, but really, we have to get rid of that enabler. Otherwise, it's just going to enable things to just reset again. Or
right.
Dana, your Reki History Kamigawa deck, we have laughed on stream time and time again how quickly that deck rebuilds because you're just able to redeploy so very quickly. And so, yes, Reki's going to do some scary things, but has it already done the damage, or is it not going to do the damage for a couple more turns? That's a very important gameplay decision I think players could get a little more skilled at, myself most certainly included.
Yeah, the thing that is making the tokens might not be as important to get rid of right now as the doubling season that would amplify that to more lethal status. The sacrifice outlet, those are famous things that should be one of your first targets for removal, right? Your Phyrexian altars and all of them. That might be the thing that you need to get rid of on an Aristocrats player's board before you get rid of their Conrad, because them actually being able to sacrifice stuff is the real thing that's going to hurt the most right now, not just the thing that does the damage. So yeah, good distinction.
I once heard someone refer to that as a Smothering Tithe problem versus a Dockside Extortionist problem.
Sure.
Those are 2 different kind of problems. The Dockside Extortionist problem the problem has already occurred. the Smothering Tithe problem is a problem that will continue to occur, and you need to respond to those things in different ways.
Yeah, I really like that a lot. Now, on the subject of removal, I have one, I guess, final question for you guys here, specifically as we talk about some of these like super powerhouse cards. And definitely we've noticed a trend lately where WotC makes some super powerhouse commanders as well that kind of will be both engine and payoff, for example. Or there'll be such a powerful engine that it is like really, really scary and you can build the entire deck all around them. Is this a trend that you guys have noticed affecting your brewing, not just if you are building one of those commanders, but when you know the rest of the world and the rest of the players at the table that you're going to sit at, if you think that they will have some of those commanders? Like if you are building around one of those decks and the power of the commander, will that affect, you know, if you've got a superpower commander, are you more inclined to play more protection because you know it's so good? Or is this a thing that maybe encourages you, for example, to run more removal of different types of removal because you know that other commanders out there might be trending towards being really big engines? Is this all made up in my head? I don't know. Take it away, you guys, if there's any feeling that you've got about that.
Speaking for myself personally, I just don't tend to build new commanders very often, or if I
right,
do...
this was a false question to ask you. I'm sorry.
If I do, I'm not picking those ones. Nothing against that. Again, to be clear, it's just not what provides me with satisfaction when I play. I will say this, though. I have in recent years found myself running more Darksteel Mutation or Chemist Transformation kind of effects that aren't necessarily just one-off removals. They are removal spells that kind of linger. So there, it's not just like, oh, okay, I Swords to Plowshare your commander and it's going to be back out next turn doing the same thing again. So I have found myself doing a little bit more of that, finding ways to remove particularly problem game pieces from the board for more than just 1 or 2 turns. That's really the big change I think I've made.
Yeah, I would agree with Dana's point. Lingering answers, that I kind of like to refer to them as things that keep the bad thing from coming back over and over again, or coming being able to be replayed. Now, sometimes there are ways around it. If you're playing an Aristocrats deck, chances are you don't care about a Darksteel Mutation, but that is a very, very good way to address problem commanders. It's not fun, but stuff like Drannith Magistrate, if that's the type of game that your playgroups are into, then absolutely that's a fantastic resource. Maybe not great for more casual circles, but it just really depends on how cutthroat your playgroup is. That's kind of the big thing. And if there is something that maybe you're warping your decks around to, that's kind of a non-gameplay type of issue that you probably want to take care of with Rule Zero conversations. But yes, finding ways to address things in a more permanent way with other permanents is a fantastic answer that I also have found myself just kind of circling back to more and more.
I'm really into that. Like those are, there's a lot of different types of removal to explore there. So it isn't just about necessarily the density, but also like having a varied version of them is, that's a really good thing that I think maybe I'm already doing. Like I play Lignifies and things like that in my decks, but I don't know if I had consciously realized that was the reason why I was doing that. I do feel like I have shifted to playing a few more pinpoint removal spells over time. But so there's been a conversation in the EDH community about like the format is picking up speed and therefore people are playing more pinpoint removal. And that's something that I haven't been quite as certain about myself, but I have certainly noticed that I tend to play more of those low mana cost and instant speed removal spells than I used to because of how bonkers some of the commanders out there have been able to be. You know, every time that, I don't know, when New Zayatora comes out, and I'm just like, this has a lot of text on it. I feel like I'm just afraid of this. When Toxrill comes out, and I'm just like, this has a lot of text on it. I think I'm afraid of this. I don't want to give that commander the chance to do stuff. So those pinpoint things feel like they're becoming more valuable to me, not even for speed reasons, but just because I feel like some of these powerhouse commanders out there need to be kept in check somehow. And maybe I don't have as many turns as I think I do against them. So it's interesting to see those. It does feel like we've all got our different answers about that. And I think that's the only way that it can be done is with, as you mentioned, different types of answers. So I'm way into that, even though it wasn't the answer I expected. I really love it.
Yeah. And I wonder how much webcam EDH changed some of that too, where you just felt like, at least I found myself running a few less board wipes as well because I was playing on spell table a lot, and I found myself like, I just don't want to reset this game. I don't want to start things over right now. And everyone has to shuffle up and deal with it. Like it's just, for some reason, it's a different vibe than it is when you're playing in person. So that was maybe some of that as well. I switched to a little more pinpoint removal as a result of playing a lot more online than maybe I used to in person.
Well, I would say I prepare because, unlike Dana, I'm also building those new commanders. I'm keeping up with the times when it comes to, this new commander is very powerful. Well, great. You have a commander from 6 months ago. I have a commander from 3 months ago. So being able to kind of go step for step with a lot of folks, it's kind of a rising tides raises all ships type of thing. New cards are coming out and I have access to them as well. So just by keeping up with the decks, which I'm not always the greatest at, but then being able to pick up a card here and there, the power levels are never really getting too far apart. But also if one person's decks are getting kind of pulling away from the rest of the pack, that again, it kind of becomes a rule zero conversation. So now that especially the paper events are coming back in, people are going to Magic Fests and all those different things, being able to be clear and concise about what kind of games you're looking for, making sure you're not misleading people a little bit on the power levels of your decks. Maybe you are playing one of the more powerful commanders, like, okay, but I'm also doing the specific thing and it's not actually going to be that powerful. And if you do have that kind of deck, make sure that your deck actually follows those plans. Don't mislead people, especially intentionally. Have those rule zero conversations. Find games with people that, okay, there's a Beantown Bullies deck and we're kind of suspicious about it, but we have that pregame conversation so we know what to expect from that game. So we're kind of addressing it so it's not an actual problem because we're fixing the problem before it actually happens to be one.
Oh, Matt, you don't want to get levelered by a Beamtown Bullies deck and lose your entire library with a single swoop?
I would love not to do that. If we're going to have fun, let's have fun. If we're going to try to beat each other's brains in, let's come to an agreement beforehand. So yes, if the powerful commanders are hitting the table, I'm also playing my powerful commander decks.
Okay.
That's my biggest way of addressing the big surge in power levels, I guess, on commanders is I'm also playing powerful decks.
Okay, yeah, no, I'm way into that. And Dana, I'm glad that you still managed to build powerful decks, even though you are still stuck back in the ye old days of 2014, building commanders from a long ago. Like,
you make me feel so old now with the ye old days of 2014.
And that's old with the E at the end too, so you know it's really antiquated. Even that's the time back when they had those. Woodfall Crusher of the Primus of Faller of Zendikar, or whatever Dana called it.
Exactly.
All right. Yeah, this was really interesting.
We're just making things up. We need to wrap this.
Yes, we do. Yeah, no, this is very interesting. I think there's still a lot more that could be discovered about this, but it is a difficult lens to apply to a deck and to notice the patterns that you might have. When a deck is commander-centric or a little commander-agnostic, when your deck is very focused on that is one lens to use. And it's a very important one that we've discussed a lot on this show, but it's also very important to see as a subset of that, is your commander the way the deck wins, or is it the enabler for the way that the deck wins? And how does that affect the number of backup plans that you run in the deck and things like that? There's a lot to explore, and that's going to be an individual line that we each draw for ourselves. So I hope, listeners, that this has been an informative discussion for you. And we also want to hear from you. Like, where do you draw these lines in your own decks? It is very, very interesting for sure. But yes, let's call this episode to a close for now. So Matt, if our listeners want to get in touch with us, where is it that they can find you, bud?
So you can find me on the Twitters at Mathimus55. That's MATHIMUS55. And don't forget, Wednesday evenings, we are streaming over at twitch.tv/EDHRECast, where we have guests on every single week. And it is always a super fun time. So make sure you tune in for all of that as well.
And Dana, how about you?
You can find me on the Twitter birds at Dana Roach. You can hear me on my other podcast, CMDR Central. I'm writing articles for EDHREC and Commander's Herald. And you can find all of us together at patreon.com/EDHRECast.
And I'm Joey Schultz. You can find me at Joseph M. Schultz on Twitter, and you can find the cast at EDHRECast on Facebook and on Twitter. Plus, if you've got a question for us, you can contact us at EDHRECast@gmail.com. Our thanks go out once again to Chase for assisting me with the post-production of the show. You can find them online at Mana Curves. And listeners, we'll be back at you next week with more data and insights. But until then, remember, EDHREC your deck before you wreck your deck.